Two cops laughed as they arrested a black man for no reason, until they walked into court and realized he was the judge deciding their fate. The road was nearly empty, just a few distant headlights slicing through the dark. Nathan was heading home after a long day, his suit jacket resting on the passenger seat. He'd done this drive 100 times before. Tonight should have been no different. But the sudden flash of red and blue in his rear-view mirror told him otherwise. He exhaled, easing his car to the side of the road. His hands stayed visible on the wheel as he waited. He knew the drill. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind him. A flashlight beam sliced through the driver's window, blinding him for a second. "License and registration," the officer barked. The second one, standing slightly behind, rested his hand on his holster. Nathan reached for his wallet slowly. "Can I ask why I was pulled over?" The first officer ignored the question, flicking his light around the car's interior. "You live around here?" Nathan's jaw tensed, but his voice remained steady. "Yes, sir. Just heading home from work." The officer scoffed. "Where do you work?" "I'm a judge." The words hung in the air for a second. The second officer smirked. "A judge?" He stepped closer. "You got ID to prove that?" Nathan handed over his driver's license and work credentials. The first officer took them, but barely glanced at them before shoving them back. "Step out of the car." Nathan hesitated. "Did I do something wrong?" "Step out." A muscle in Nathan's jaw twitched. He unbuckled his seatbelt and got out, keeping his hands where they could see them. He knew better than to argue. The first officer moved behind him. "Turn around, hands behind your back." Nathan barely had time to process what was happening before cold metal snapped around his wrists. "What's the charge?" he asked, his voice still calm. "Resisting arrest," the officer said flatly. Nathan let out a slow breath. He wasn't resisting. He hadn't done anything. But he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The second officer grabbed his wallet from the roof of the car and flipped through it, shaking his head. "This guy's full of it," he muttered. "Judge my ass." Nathan said nothing. He knew the system well enough to recognize what was happening. And he also knew one thing for sure. These officers had no idea who they had just handcuffed, but they were about to find out. Nathan felt the cold steel of the handcuffs lock around his wrists, the weight of them heavier than it should have been. His fingers instinctively flexed, testing the limits of movement. It wasn't the first time he had worn cuffs. He had handled them before in court, when they were on the wrists of men and women whose fates he had to decide. But tonight, they were his burden to bear. The first officer tightened them with a rough jerk, the metal biting into his skin. Nathan took a steady breath. He could feel the adrenaline humming under his skin, but he refused to let it show. The second officer stepped closer, a smug smirk on his lips. "You think you're special?" The words were laced with quiet venom. "You think that little judge act was gonna get you out of this?" Nathan held his gaze, refusing to rise to the bait. "I told you the truth." The first officer chuckled under his breath. "Yeah? Well, here's another truth. You don't give orders out here. We do." Nathan felt a rough hand on his shoulder, pushing him forward. The gravel underfoot crunched as they led him toward the squad car. Every step felt surreal, like he was watching it happen to someone else. He had spent years upholding the law, believing in the structure of it, in its capacity to bring justice. But tonight, he was being swallowed by it. "Face down," the first officer ordered, as they reached the car. Nathan hesitated for just a second. He knew how this played out. He had seen it. A wrong move, a misunderstood gesture, and things could go from bad to worse in the blink of an eye. He leaned forward slowly, pressing his forehead against the cool surface of the car as they searched his pockets. Wallet, phone. "What's this?" The second officer yanked out his ID. Nathan heard the shuffle of fingers flipping through the plastic sleeve. The man scoffed. "Judge Nathaniel Carter," he read aloud, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Would you look at that?" The first officer peeked over his shoulder, snatching the ID away. "I'll be damned. He actually is a judge." For a moment neither of them spoke. Nathan could almost hear the gears turning in their heads, trying to figure out how to handle the sudden revelation. But it didn't take long before the first officer shoved the ID back into Nathan's wallet like it didn't mean a thing. "Doesn't change a damn thing," he muttered. "Take him in." Nathan lifted his head slightly. "For what?" The officer snapped his fingers toward the other one, who had already started jotting something down. "Obstruction, resisting, suspicious activity. We'll figure it out." Nathan exhaled slowly through his nose. He had seen this before. He had ruled on cases like this, thin charges meant to justify an arrest, excuses that would crumble under scrutiny in a courtroom. But right now, that didn't matter. What mattered was that they had already decided he was guilty. The door to the squad car swung open, and the first officer shoved Nathan inside. The plastic seat was hard and unforgiving, the air thick with the stench of sweat and stale cigarette smoke. He settled back against the seat, staring at the barred partition between him and the front of the car. Through the windshield, he could see the second officer still smirking as he leaned against the hood, talking into his radio. They thought they had won. They thought they had put another one in their place. Nathan remained silent, his pulse steady. They had no idea what was coming. The station was colder than it needed to be. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, washing everything in a sickly glow. Nathan sat on the hard bench in the holding cell, his hands resting loosely on his knees. His wrists still bore the imprint of the cuffs, the dull ache, a lingering reminder of the night's absurdity. He watched as an officer at the desk processed his paperwork, pausing every now and then to glance at him. The looks varied. Some curious, some amused, some indifferent. No one saw him as a man. Just another black face in a cell, another body passing through the system. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years listening to defendants describe mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. Some stories seemed too extreme to be true. But now, sitting in this cell, he knew better. He wasn't just hearing about the cracks in the system, he was inside them. Carter. The sound of his name pulled him from his thoughts. A sergeant stood outside the cell, holding a clipboard. His eyes skimmed over the paper before he gave Nathan a long, appraising look. "You're free to go." Nathan didn't react right away. "Charges?" The sergeant exhaled sharply. "Dropped." Of course. They had nothing to hold him on. But they hadn't needed a reason to arrest him in the first place, only an excuse. As the cell door slid open, Nathan rose to his feet. He walked out with his back straight, his face composed. But inside, something burned. He wasn't angry. He had moved beyond anger long ago. What he felt was something deeper, a slow, simmering understanding of exactly how far some people were willing to go to remind men like him of their place. His phone and wallet were returned at the desk, tossed across the counter without a word. He picked them up carefully, sliding his ID back into its sleeve. The officer at the desk leaned in slightly. "You got lucky tonight." Nathan met his gaze, a small, unreadable smile playing at the corner of his lips. "You have no idea." He stepped out into the night air, inhaling deeply. The world outside hadn't changed. The streetlights still flickered. Cars still passed. Life continued. But for Nathan, things were different now. This wasn't just a bad night. This was something that would follow him into the courtroom. Not as a scar, but as a reminder. Because the next time he saw those officers, the power dynamic would be very, very different. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Officers in uniform, legal clerks, a few reporters, everyone waiting for the start of a disciplinary hearing that had gained more attention than expected. Sergeant Daniel Briggs and Officer Kyle Mercer sat stiffly at the defense table, their uniforms pressed and polished, but their faces were anything but confident. This wasn't a routine hearing. The charges, racial profiling, misconduct, false arrest, had started small. But as complaints stacked up, the department had no choice but to take action. They had been through disciplinary boards before. Internal affairs investigations. They knew how to navigate these things. Keep their statements brief. Show no emotion. Let the union rep handle the technicalities. But then, the door behind the bench opened. Nathan entered, his black robe flowing behind him as he walked up to the judge's seat. He moved with deliberate slowness, his expression unreadable. The courtroom, buzzing with quiet conversations just moments ago, fell into absolute silence. The officers stiffened. Their attorney glanced at them, confused. Briggs's mouth went dry. Mercer's face turned pale. It took several seconds for them to understand what they were seeing, what was happening. But when the truth hit, it hit hard. The man they had shoved against his car, the man they had laughed at, the man they had locked in a holding cell for no reason, was Judge Nathaniel Carter. Nathan took his seat at the bench, adjusting the microphone. His gaze swept the room, finally landing on them. No smirk, no satisfaction, no words, not yet. The tension was unbearable. Mercer shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the table. Briggs's jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. Neither of them could move. Nathan tapped a gavel against the desk, his voice calm, steady. This hearing will now come to order. He let the silence stretch, watching as understanding fully settled in their eyes. They had arrested the very man who now had the power to decide their fate. Nathan let the silence hang for a few beats longer, just enough for the weight of the moment to settle in. The courtroom wasn't just quiet. It was charged. Every single person present knew what had happened. They could feel the irony pressing in from all sides. Briggs cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Mercer kept his eyes locked on the table, his hands clasped tightly together as if he could will himself invisible. Nathan finally spoke, his voice measured but firm. Officers Briggs and Mercer, you are here today due to multiple complaints of racial profiling, misconduct, and unlawful arrest. You have both denied these allegations, stating that your stops and arrests were justified and based on reasonable suspicion. His fingers tapped against the desk, methodical and slow. He let his words sink in before continuing. But reasonable suspicion, as you should both be well aware, is not a gut feeling. It is not a guess, and it is certainly not a tool to justify detaining innocent people simply because they make you uncomfortable. Mercer flinched. Briggs clenched his fists, but said nothing. Nathan leaned forward slightly, eyes fixed on them. Tell me, officers, was I resisting when I was standing outside my car that night? Briggs didn't answer. Mercer's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. Was I obstructing justice when I handed you my identification and complied with your orders? More silence. Nathan nodded, as if their silence was all the answer he needed. He turned to the department's representative, who sat stiffly at the side table. Officer Mercer and Sergeant Briggs have a history of questionable stops, don't they? The department rep hesitated, then nodded. There have been prior complaints, yet no action was taken. Again, silence. Nathan exhaled, straightening. Here's what's going to happen. Briggs finally looked up, eyes burning with desperation. Mercer looked like he was holding his breath. You will be suspended immediately pending a full investigation into your prior stops. Every case, every report, every interaction you've had in the past 5 years will be reviewed. If a pattern emerges, and I have every reason to believe it will, then termination will be the least of your concerns. Briggs opened his mouth to protest, but Nathan held up a hand. And just in case either of you still think this is personal, Nathan continued, his tone never shifting, I won't be the one making the final ruling. A judicial panel will review the evidence. Mercer exhaled, shoulders slumping. He knew what that meant. There would be no favors, no easy exits. This was real. Nathan tapped his gavel lightly. This hearing is concluded. Briggs shot up from his seat, his face red with frustration. But there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to fight. Nathan stood, gathering his papers. As he turned to leave, he paused just for a moment, glancing back at them one last time. I told you the truth that night, he said simply. You just didn't want to believe it. Then he walked out, leaving them to sit with the consequences of their actions. And for the first time, they finally understood what accountability felt like. Nathan stepped out of the courtroom and into the hallway, his breathing steady, his mind clear. The moment he had been waiting for, not revenge but justice, had finally arrived. Yet, as much as the officers had deserved every consequence coming their way, he felt no satisfaction in their downfall. Because this wasn't just about 2 cops. It wasn't just about one bad night. It was about a system. one that allowed men like Briggs and Mercer to operate unchecked for years, a system where the burden of proof always seemed heavier for people who looked like him. He walked past the rows of reporters waiting outside the courtroom doors. Questions flew at him. "Judge Carter, do you have a comment? Do you believe justice was served? What do you say to those who think this was personal?" He stopped, turned to the cameras, and spoke calmly, clearly. This was never about personal revenge. It was about accountability. No one should fear those who are sworn to protect them. And no one, not even those in uniform, is above the law. The reporters scrambled for more, but he was done talking. He had said what mattered. Nathan walked down the courthouse steps, the weight of the night 2 weeks ago finally lifting. He wasn't naive enough to believe that one hearing would change everything. But it was a start. And sometimes, a start is enough to make people pay attention. If we allow abuse of power to go unchecked, we become complicit in the system that allows it to exist. The fight for justice is not about revenge. It's about ensuring that no one else has to go through what so many have already endured. Nathan stepped into his car, adjusting the rearview mirror before pulling away from the courthouse. Somewhere out there, another black man would be pulled over tonight. But maybe, just maybe, tonight would be different. If you believe in justice, if you believe in accountability, share this story. Let's make sure it reaches the people who need to hear it most.